So after the sighting of land, the Mayflower anchors off of Cape Cod, and the Mayflower's arrival in New England comes as a surprise to the Pilgrims because they were expecting to arrive in the northern regions of Virginia, which is now present-day New York by the Hudson River. That's where their target was. So they tried to go around, but various weather issues and the dangerous shoals prevent them from going further south, and they end up having to start exploring in New England in the Massachusetts Bay Area for a place to settle. So this difficulty was certainly a providential blessing, because it was the shoreline where they end up settling is probably the only area in with several hundred miles where they could have set up a sustainable settlement. It was the only unoccupied land in the region there because the Patuxent tribe had been wiped out by a plague several years before, and it had been abandoned ever since. So they began searching for a place to land in the waters there, and throughout the month of November, they're exploring different possible settlement sites. And so on December 16th, the Mayflower drops anchor in Plymouth Bay, and then first common house is erected on December 25th.
As the men started building homes on the land, the frigid reality of winter set in. And I think this, from what the accounts say, this took them by surprise because New England winters, as we all know, are nothing like Old English winters. And they're much more severe, and there was no possibility of planting a crop. So they were already running out of food on board ship, and the sailors didn't really want to share because they had to go home at some point. And also there was nothing to grow on the land that was there. It was winter. It was already there. So while scurvy and other illnesses had been an issue on board ship, now they had to deal with exposure and cold. And a lot of people suffered directly those first few weeks on shore, and then their deaths were explained by that later. So one of the accounts says that they were digging a grave during that winter almost every 3 days, which is incredible to think about doing. If we thought it was bad to get there, once they got there, the pain and difficulty, the starvation set in. It was just some of the most horrific circumstances that you could imagine. And the thing that surprises me the most is that when April came and the ship set out for England, none of them got back on the boat. So it was a moment of victory for them because in spite of losing about 50% of their population in a few short months, they remained confident they were doing the right thing and that God was sovereign and that their goal was more important to them than any one of their individual survival. So this is something that's really sobering and also encouraging to see in the lives of the Pilgrims.
One of the mighty providences of God during the first winter was the turning back of the Indians from attacking the Pilgrims' settlement. When the Pilgrims first arrived, there were a few skirmishes, but most of the effort of the Pilgrims was in constructing their settlement and just surviving the first winter, making sure they made it through. And this made them fairly vulnerable to an Indian attack. And there were two distinct times when they were surrounded by Indians who were going to come and attack them in the dead of night. And as the Indians approached, they were overcome by a spirit of fear, at which point they turned back and did not attack. And that happened two distinct times. And they recognized, after many of them were led to Christianity afterwards, that that was a providence of God that had enabled the settlement to survive the first winter and not be taken out.
And so after this long and stressing winter, because it was difficult with only half of their population surviving after the winter, into the camp walks a half-naked Native American and greets them in English. His name is Samoset, and he's the first Indian that they have interaction with, other than they had a few skirmishes beforehand, but he's the first one that they had a dialogue with. And it shouldn't have been surprising to them that he spoke English, because the Native Americans had contact with others, the French and Portuguese sailors as well as English sailors who had been mapping and exploring these coastlines for several years. These sailors would trade with the Indians and for food and various items that they could sell and profit on their return home. And so a short while later, after they meet Samoset, he introduces them to Squantum, or as commonly know him as Squanto. And he is a huge help to the Pilgrim settlement there. He had previously been enslaved and taken to England and to Spain before. So he'd been across the Atlantic several times, and he is the sole surviving member of the Patuxet tribe who had previously lived in the area where Plymouth is founded. So he had suffered some very terrible things in his life, but through a special divine providence, he was spared death in his village, that he could then aid the Pilgrims and spare further death in theirs and bring the hope and survival of the Plymouth colony. Bradford calls Squanto a special instrument sent by God for their good, and we're indebted to his kindness, Squanto's, as well as the resources that were shared by the Native Americans that helped the early settlers in America. They traded their foods and showed the settlers how to farm, how to plant gardens that would grow and sustain a crop and in the New England soil. And they pursued peace and mutual respect, and without their help, it's unlikely that the Plymouth colony would have survived.